In 1611, in response to the seismic changes taking place in European thought, the Scottish poet John Donne penned the following words. And new philosophy calls all in doubt. The element of fire is quite put out. The sun is lost, and the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. And freely men confess that this world's spent, when in the planets and the firmament they seek so many new, they say that this is crumbled out again to his atoms. 'Tis all in pieces, all coherence gone, all just supply and relation. Prince, subject, father, son, all things are forgot. For every man thinks he hath got to be a phoenix, and that then can be none of that kind, of which he is but he. In these lines, we see reference to the great discoveries of his time: atomism, magnetism, new worlds around Jupiter. In later parts of this work, Donne goes on to mention the great voyages of discovery and the technologies that enabled them. Yet, in these words, we sense a profound disquiet of a man witnessing a revolution and not being sure where it will all lead. Donne knew the figures who had put forward the ideas he mentioned. He knew William Gilbert in his work on magnetism. He had met Galileo while staying with the English ambassador in Venice. He conversed with the atomist and mathematician Thomas Harriot. He read Kepler's commentary on Galileo's starry messenger. Perhaps he'd even met Giordano Bruno when the iconoclast had spent some time in London. From all of these interactions, Donne must have known that he was in the middle of something monumentous. Never before had so many discoveries been announced, so many ancient and revered ideas overturned. Yet, he was in the minority on this. For most of his contemporaries, the revolution taking place under their noses would go mostly unnoticed. But make no mistake, a revolution it was. It's a revolution that continues to fundamentally shape our world, even today. Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 20, Scientific Revolution, The Discovery of Discovery. When discussing what is broadly called the scientific revolution, one has to navigate, it seems, between Scylla and Charybdis. On the one hand, there are those writers, especially during the 19th century, along with the triumph of chemistry, who claim that the 16th and 17th centuries, something arose in Europe that was completely unique and unprecedented in the history of thought, that completely changed the way humanity saw itself and the cosmos in which it was immersed. On the other hand, is the assertion that such a notion is completely illusory, a product of Western imperialism that ignores the earlier foundational work in which people created knowledge from the interaction with the natural world, going back to times before written records were kept. We, the crew of the Odyssey, are skilled navigators, and so I am confident we can find our way between the whirlpool on one side and the rock shoals on the other without losing ship or crew. The historiography of the scientific revolution is a complicated mix of things, and I don't think we need to go into full detail on all of it here. While I do want to sketch out just a bit of the conversation, For those seeking a fuller account of the various points of view, I would recommend David Wooten's The Invention of Science, which will serve as a source for this podcast and has an excellent discussion of the various positions about the scientific revolution and whether it happened and how it came about and how historically various thinkers have looked at it. So, what's our little sketch? The term scientific revolution isn't actually a very old one, historically speaking. It certainly wasn't used in the time period we'll be talking about, the 16th and 17th centuries, nor during the period shortly thereafter. Unlike during the American and French revolutions, which were understood to be revolutionary during the time in which they happened and were written about in such a way by the chroniclers of the events, there wasn't an immediate recognition of the fundamental way in which people understood the natural world as having changed. In fact, the term, the scientific revolution, wouldn't come into broad use until a series of lectures given at Cambridge in 1948. These seem to have been based on a usage of the term by the famed historian of science Alexander Koyrä from a 1935 essay. The term, as associated with the 17th century, likely actually originated even before that in the work of the American pragmatist philosopher and educational reformer John Dewey, when he wrote something about it in about 1915. Its popularization out of historical and philosophical circles through lectures, those ones given at Cambridge specifically, may well have developed or been adopted from an earlier term, something we all know as the Industrial Revolution, something that arises, by the way, in Marxist writing based on the usage of Horace Greeley in that famous revolutionary year of 1848. It is, of course, Thomas Kuhn, with his two seminal works, The Copernican Revolution and The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, written in 1957 and 1962 respectively, that not only bring that term, the scientific revolution, into the full modern consciousness, but also seek to create a multiplicity of revolutions, all scientific in nature, as well as to explain their origins. This, of course, serves to highlight another interesting issue: how to actually date the revolution, scientific, or revolutions, multiple sciences. Unlike those revolutions based in, say, social or political conflict, intellectual movements don't usually have clear beginning or ending points. They tend to be more amorphous in many ways, and, as with many revolutions, the outcome is not what was intended when the process began. Just as the outcome of the American Revolution, the Constitution of the United States, is very different from what was envisioned in Thomas Paine's Common Sense, the universe described in Newton's Principia is something fundamentally different from the predominantly Aristotelian heliocentrism first proposed by Nicholas Copernicus in his book On the Revolutions of the Spheres, which, as we've noted in the past, is one of the first uses of the term revolution, having, of course, a completely different meaning than the one we consider now. This, of course, also is what leads to the other position in this discussion about whether there's a scientific revolution or not, and that is, there is no such thing as a scientific revolution. Many modern scholars claim that the term is a fallacy. As every single one of my sources that I've used for the podcast delights to point out, Stephen Sharpen's 1996 book, The Scientific Revolution, opens with the line, quote, "There is no such thing as a scientific revolution, and this is a book about it," end quote. The core of the argument centers around what is meant by the term science and whether it was something practiced by individuals prior to the 2 or so century period we'll be discussing in the next couple of episodes. Critics of the term suggest that while things such as astrology and astronomy may not be considered scientific now, they were certainly scientific in that they consisted of a system of organized observation and practice that had the important implications on the society around them. The claim, then, is that we moderns are imposing our systems of thought, our large encompassing narratives, on an earlier time without taking into account how those people living before the 16th century would have understood things. It is Wittgenstein who first advances a more relativistic perspective, something that can actually be seen to influence how Kuhn conceptualizes his many scientific revolutions. More directly, this idea of relativism will work its way through philosophical thought in the form of postmodernism and will result in Paul Feyerabend's work Against Method, wherein he argues that what we call science has changed so much over time and in so many different ways that there really is no what we would call a scientific method, and thus the idea of a scientific revolution is pretty much without meaning. This, however, I think, flies directly in the face of experience. If you ask 100 historians and scientists when the modern idea of science comes about, almost all of them will point to this period, in the 150 or so years between 1550 and 1700. While we may debate exactly what transpired during this time, and that debate is very, very much a helpful one, there is no question that something took place during that time. Wooten's claim is that there is a fundamental change in how those practicing mathematics and natural philosophy saw themselves. As he writes, quote, "A basic description of the scientific revolution is to say that it represented a successful rebellion by the mathematicians against the authority of the philosophers and theologians. A late example of this rebellion is apparent in Newton's title, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, a title which is a deliberate act of defiance." End quote. What we like to do in this episode is to dig into what it was. To do that, we need to summarize what things were like before the publication of Copernicus's book and some things that happened around that time, and the subsequent developments that follow from it. As you know, if you've been following this series up to this point, the origins of the scientific revolution can be traced to a great number of sources, from the ancient focus on attributing natural phenomena to natural causes from the Greeks, and an emphasis on careful measurement from the Mesopotamians, through to the extension and expansion of these works by the scholars of the Arabic and Islamic traditions. To this can be added a number of earlier European renaissances that include those of Charlemagne in the 9th century, the scholastic universities in the 12th and 13th centuries, and the Italian flowering in the 15th century. Each of these were aided by the rediscovery of knowledge lost to Europe either through contact with Arab caliphates or the Byzantine Empire. In the former, the works of one great Greek philosopher, Aristotle, were recovered, while in the second it was the works of another, Plato. Finally, into this mix were blended the contributions of millennia of practical inquiry into what worked best to produce technologies that made life easier to navigate, such as practical herbal medicine and metallurgy. As such, before we launch into what it was that did change, let's take a few moments to think about what someone might have believed near the beginning of, say, the 16th century. Perhaps we can think of a gentleman in the Italian countryside, or a middle-class merchant of London. Maybe it's that navigator we followed in our early episodes of this series, or a scholastic scholar at one of the universities in France. What would they have thought in the world that they lived in? In the specific, they would have seen a world made of 4 elements that underwent change in the terrestrial realm either through corruption or generation, and thought that there was a 5th that didn't change in the celestial realm. He would have believed that all of space was filled with matter as nature abhorred a vacuum, and that rainbows were a sign of God's grace. He would have believed that history repeated itself, and that the greatest expression of human experience was the classical world of ancient Greece and Rome. He would have held that the positions of the planets in the heavens affected events and people on Earth, and that base metals could be transmuted into precious ones through an understanding of how ratios of sulfur and mercury could be adjusted in a material. He thought a person's health was controlled by the balance of 4 humors as well as the planets, and that medical practice consisted of adjusting that various balances with a knowledge of ailments and alignments. Additionally, for him, the shape and color of a plant would offer clues about its possible medicinal use. Our gentleman believes in witchcraft and demons who can summon storms and blight crops. He believes lycanthropy is real and occurs with the cycles of the planets. He thinks that dreams can predict the future if interpreted correctly. He has no problem with the idea that things can spontaneously generate themselves, such as maggots on meat or mice in bales of hay. Nor would he be surprised to read reports of bodies bleeding in the presence of their murderer. Among his possessions would have been a few books, perhaps as many as 50 if he is well off materially and stable in his place of residence. 250 years later, the counterpart of our gentleman would believe very few of these things. He has looked through both a telescope and a microscope, and seen the planets as places and a drop of water filled with hundreds and hundreds of microscopic things. There are no longer witches or werewolves or magic. Astrology and alchemy have both either been banished or modified to something more mechanistic and less mystical. There are no unicorns or other fanciful creatures, and organisms do not spontaneously generate. He believes that the earth orbits the sun, and that all of the universe is made of the same stuff, probably made of atoms of some sort. He knows that rainbows are created by light refracted through glass or water, and that the organs of the body have specific functions, such as that of the heart being a pump that circulates blood. Perhaps more important than all of these things, though, he believes that the culture he lives in is irreversibly better than those of the ancients, and that progress is a fundamental and powerful reality for all of humanity. If he is well off and stable, he owns hundreds of books, perhaps even 1,000, and has access to thousands and thousands more through his local library. He himself may be engaged in the direct investigation of nature and, if so, part of an academy of like-minded and engaged individuals who gather and communicate regularly to discuss the latest work and discoveries made across Europe. From this, I think it's clear that something did take place in that 150 years or so, between 1550 and 1700, that marked out what would become known as science as a different method of inquiry from others from which it emerged. In this period, in disciplines as diverse as astronomy and biology, not only was significant progress made in understanding the various systems being investigated, there arose a group of interrelated practices that redefined what it meant to investigate the natural world. This emergence did not occur as fully in other eras and in other places, and in those places where similar fledgling processes did come about, they did not survive the upheavals civilizations variously encounter in the way it did in Europe during this time. The reason for this, I think, has to do with fundamental shifts in how a group of individuals came to see themselves and what they were doing, very differently than their predecessors had. As such, it behooves us to examine how this shift came about, rooted as it was in older ways of thinking, and then to discuss the unique properties those various individuals claimed were essential to the proper conduct of science to produce reliable knowledge. In this episode, we'll focus on the former, what conditions and events set the stage for the scientific revolution to take place. And then next week, we'll look at the tools that the various practitioners, men such as Gilbert, Bacon, Kepler, Galileo, and Descartes, developed to push that knowledge forward. So, now that we've thought a bit about what some of the specifics are of what an upper middle class, reasonably well-educated person of their time might have thought, let's zoom out just a bit to think about the worldview that would have been in place just prior to 1540, let's say. We've already discussed some of the really important things that are in place. Things like the scholastic and Philippist universities, and also the various technologies that came together to create the printing press and associated printing technology. We've looked at the rediscovery of the works of first Aristotle and then Plato, and then the creation of urban centers and a more stable set of political entities. These things altogether gave rise to a number of other important things: the rise of humanism, the spread of Reformation ideas in religion, and a focus on harmony in the natural world. Humanism can be a tricky thing to define, but let me start off by saying we should not confuse the idea of humanism during the 15th century Italian Renaissance with the much more modern idea of secular humanism. This earlier form of humanism really seems to focus on an earlier classical idea of human flourishing as a result of connecting humanity to the fullness of experience, whether that be through music, the study of the natural world, the engaging of literature, social discourse, or what have you. In this picture, all areas of inquiry have aspects that could be thought of as both knowledge and practice, known as science and art respectively. As we've mentioned previously, an artisan is one who puts knowledge into practice, and so an astrological physician is one who will take the science of astrology and put it into practice by creating a horoscope to better develop a treatment plan for a patient. Perhaps no single individual better characterizes this entire synthesis than Leonardo da Vinci. One result of this focus on human flourishing is the establishment of communities of scholarship and learning outside of the traditional universities. As we have seen, this is of particular importance in the narrative we've been following in cosmology up to this point. We've also discussed the impact of the printing press in some detail, but there's one additional point that should be made regarding its influences in what will become the sciences. When manuscripts were hand-copied, diagrams were difficult to produce, as they were time-consuming, didn't lend themselves to be created in the scriptoriums of the medieval period, and they depended on the understanding of the associated material and the skill of the copyist as an artist. With the development of movable type, woodcuts and other similar tools could be used to create complex diagrams that were identical in every copy of a book with little additional expense. The same was true for mathematical tables. Finally, with the rise of the Reformation, due in part to the clever and extensive use of the printing press, the educational apparatus of Philip Melanchthon, known as the Preceptor Germanae, or Teacher of Germany, it was responsible for spreading these ideas of humanism deep into Protestant culture. With the establishment of the Counter-Reformation after the Council of Trent, there was a similarly new emphasis on education and scholarship in the Catholic Church, especially amongst the monastic orders, specifically the Jesuits. When these people looked out into the world, what did they see? They saw a creation intimately connected in ways that we moderns would find completely unfamiliar. In it, everything that has its place specifically in something known as Plato's Scala Naturale, or ladder of nature. This is where everything sort of gets put in a specific place in a specific organizational scheme. More than this, though, what was seen was a connection between the macrocosm and the microcosm, as represented in the Timaeus, Plato's account of the origins and structures of the cosmos. The idea here is that things on the larger scale, planets and stars, were constructed according to similar principles by a maker to those things on a smaller earthly scale, and thus they would share relations between them. This was reflected in later classical and Arabic writings, such as the works titled Hermetica and the Emerald Tables. One concise way this idea was represented in the early modern period was to say, as above, so below. This idea will carry along for well beyond the Renaissance through the scientific revolution and into the Enlightenment. One of the most important upshots of it was that things here on earth were governed by an ordered and rational arrangement, just as the heavens were. This principle would guide first Galileo and Kepler, and later Newton. And once they had shown it to be true, at least in the realms of physics and astronomy, the philosophers and savants of the period afterwards, men such as Locke and Rousseau, would incorporate that same ethos, that same principle, into all of their writings. Moreover, this would interact with Aristotle's idea that to understand an object, one had to define it in terms of its four causes. The efficient cause, which described who or what made the thing. The material cause, which described what the thing was made from. The formal cause, describing the thing's physical characteristics. And finally, the final cause, which expressed what the thing was made for or what its goal for existing was. This focus had the effect of describing an object or an idea in relationship or context with other things, thus reinforcing the connections between it and everything else. In other words, the thing to keep in mind here is for somebody in the early modern period, everything was connected. Everything on earth was connected and everything in the heavens. And those connections, that the knowledge of those connections specifically, was where all true science and art lie. Perhaps the best way to represent this is by looking at the work of the Jesuit polymath Athanasius Kircher. Kircher is a fascinating figure who kept something of a museum in Rome that was a must-see destination for any scholar that visited the city. The book that he wrote, something devoted to the study of magnetism, titled Magnus Sive de Magnetica Arte, began with a frontispiece or picture that denoted the various branches of knowledge encapsulated in a series of circular seals, each connected by a continuous chain to the others. This expressed the idea that all of the branches of knowledge and study together were one unity of knowledge or study. Each of these were also changed to three larger seals, representing the three spheres of the natural world: the sidereal or celestial world, the sublunar or terrestrial world, and the microcosmic or natural world. These two are changed to each other to show their connectedness. We'll put a copy of the frontispiece on the podcast website, thescientificodyssey.typepad.com, for you to take a look at when you have a moment. It's really quite a wonderful work of art. As you look, you'll notice at the very center of the image, touching all three of the world spheres, is the mundus archetypicus, or archetypal world, the mind of God that has created everything and contains everything. In the scroll work in the picture that you can see woven through the seals and spheres is the Latin for everything rests placidly, connected by hidden knots. From this, we can see that for Kircher, the natural philosopher studied the natural world within the framework of liberal arts conjoined with metaphysics and theology. This led to the idea of what is sometimes called magia naturalis, or sometimes it's called natural magic, or better, natural mastery. This was the practice of understanding the connections between the various things in the natural world, Aristotle's episteme, or knowledge, to manipulate them for best practical effect, Aristotle's techne, or to put another way, it is the practice of science and art. An example of this sort of connection can be seen on Kircher's front piece, with the seal that contains the sunflower. Not only does this plant turn to follow the sun through the sky, when it blooms, the flower looks more than just a little bit like the sun itself, both in shape and color. To the practitioner of natural mastery, this indicated a special link or connection between the microcosmic plant and the macroscopic planet, one that can be used to great benefit. Hence, the physician might make a medicine from the sunflower or its seeds to treat a condition of the heart, which was thought to be the organ of the human body that was connected to the sun. Seeing such connections, at least ones not as obvious as the sunflower/sun association, required the practitioner to engage in careful observation of the natural world. It also required the use of induction in moving from specific reported instances of a phenomenon or connection to the determination of a general principle. This principle can then be used to deduce certain outcomes, consequences, and applications. This process, something the scholastic philosopher Robert Grosseteste would call resolution and composition as far back as the 13th century, would form much of the foundation of the thinking in natural philosophy during the 15th and early 16th centuries, and would be modified by those that would follow it. Perhaps one of the most overlooked factors in understanding the environment from which the scientific revolution grew out of is that of the role of religion and religious institutions in Europe. As we've said before, there has grown this erroneous narrative that pits religion and science against each other. It was a narrative that's been fostered or was fostered during the Enlightenment and the period that follows and continues clear up until today. However, the truth is that much of what we think of as natural philosophy has been promoted and encouraged by religious institutions, especially during this time that we're speaking about. It was the Catholic Church that helped establish the scholastic universities and sponsored the process of integrating the works of Aristotle into the intellectual mainstream in the 13th century. After the Reformation, it was the aforementioned Philip Melanchthon who emphasized what is known as the two books model of knowing the divine, one book being the Bible, with the other being the natural world. Because of this, the humanist movement was one in which the study of nature occupied a central and respected place. While certainly not as exalted as theology, as evidenced by that subject's place at the top of Kitcher's frontispiece, engaging in pursuits like physics, astronomy, geography, and medicine was seen as holy work. Yet in this, there was a fundamental orientation because of that. With the rediscovery of Aristotle and Plato being the things that sparked off first the 12th and then the 15th century Renaissances, there was a looking back into the past for knowledge. The focus of humanism was re-engaging with what had been lost or forgotten. There was a sense that everything that couldn't be learned had already been learned, and that the work being done was a reacquisition of the knowledge and skills that had once been possessed by earlier and greater civilizations. In the late medieval mind, and probably the early modern mind as well, it would have been, as the writer of Ecclesiastes said, quote, "There is nothing new under the sun," end quote. So, it's into this mix of social and cultural ideas and institutions that a huge shock occurred. In 1492, Columbus, on a journey to open a new trade route to the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia, instead ran into something completely new. It's difficult, as I said before, for us today to completely understand how shocking this was. First and foremost, he had found a new thing. In a world where the focus was very keenly on old things, and it was thought that there was nothing new under the sun, as we said, the finding of a whole new and unexpected landmass immediately put lie to that idea. As others explored and chronicled the extent of Columbus's new find, most notably Amerigo Vespucci, for whom the entire thing would be named, an entirely new idea began to spread throughout Europe. At this point, I should mention that I'll be putting forth an idea from David Wooten's book, one that I found pretty compelling. I want to be clear about the fact that this is not my idea in any way, shape, or form. It's important to say this because I've not really encountered this idea in any of my other reading, either for this particular episode of the podcast or in any other context that discusses the scientific revolution, and so I want to be sure to give credit where it's due. Wooten's thesis is that the most important and foundational thing that leads to what we call the scientific revolution is the emergence of the idea of discovery amongst the modern European mind around or after the time of Columbus's announcement of finding the New World. Wooten points out that prior to this time, there isn't really a word for discovery in Latin. While there are words for things like invention and the like, the Romans, like the Europeans of the 15th century who inherited so much of their ideas, didn't see the world as consisting of anything new. Writings from various Roman scholars such as Pliny might discuss things others had invented, but they didn't really think of those things as discoveries of something new. Now, this was certainly not the case with the Greeks, from whom the Romans borrowed so much. The Greeks had a sense of discovery, especially in fields like mathematics. But while the contents of their discoveries certainly made it into the Roman mind, the ethos behind them didn't. By the time you go through all of the filtering to the early modern European period, the prevailing opinion was that the Romans learned from the Greeks, who learned from the Egyptians, who learned, it was claimed, from the Semitic peoples descended from the patriarch Abraham. Thus, it is only in Portuguese that one finds a word for discovery, descobrir, as one might guess given that nation's aggressive exploration of the African coastline and the establishment of the earliest trade routes around the Indian Sea. In Latin, there are words for finding out, invenio, obtaining, reperio, and exploring, exploro, but not anything that takes into account the idea of finding something completely new. Hence, in the announcement of the various discoveries over the course of the following 100 years, authors will struggle to convey the idea that what is now being announced had never been known before. What will eventually take place is that the Latin word for uncovering or laying something open will be appropriated to describe the various voyages of discovery that follow Columbus's initial venture. This can be seen in the translations of Vespucci's letters to the King of Portugal into other language, as both the translators and readers struggle to come to grips with this idea that there are new things to be known. The first use of the word in Latin for discovery, discoperio, dates to about 1507, though this word, which like I said before literally means to uncover, must be amplified through further explanation to emphasize that what was being uncovered was not something once lost and now found again, but rather something which, in the words of Vespucci, quote, of which our forefathers made absolutely no mention, end quote. So why is this such a big deal? Don't inventions count as discoveries? Well, at the time, at least at that particular time, not really. While things like the printing press, gunpowder, and the compasses were important advances, they suffered from two deficiencies that kept them from being thought of as being truly new. The first was that they were seen as being based on either older technologies or aggregations of other similar technologies. In the case of the printing press and gunpowder, it's pretty clear that the idea or ideas had been imported into Europe along trade routes from the East, most notably China. The compass, on the other hand, was based on the well-known behavior of the lodestone, something well known to ancient Greek natural philosophers. The second issue was that prior to Columbus's discovery of the New World, the first two of these inventions had very little impact on the life of most Europeans. The printing press wouldn't show itself to be the revolutionary technology it was until the Protestant Reformation in 1517, and gunpowder wouldn't determine the outcome of warfare in a battle until 1503. The compass, while absolutely vital in facilitating open sea voyages such as Columbus's, was not used outside of that very limited world, and so wasn't recognized apart from Columbus's discovery. The key difference here, as we have said, is that after Columbus, there is that sense of not having just uncovered something, but having uncovered something wholly and completely new, as opposed to the idea of invention, which usually carried with it the connotation of having developed something from something else, something older and already known. The act of discovery is something that creates an irreversible change. When Columbus discovers America, it is something that cannot be unlearned. When Galileo first sees the moons of Jupiter and then publishes his observations, that is something that cannot be unknown any longer. Even with Crick and Watson's discovery of the structure of DNA, once this is known, the way in which we understand life and how biological information is encoded is fundamentally changed. And with this, starting back as far back as 1492, there is a complete reorientation of the European mind. Thomas Cahill, in his book The Gift of the Jews, puts forward the idea that in the story of Abraham, we get the first truly linear view of time. With Abraham's calling by his God, we see that he is not destined to repeat the endless cycles of history seen in the Mesopotamian cultures surrounding him, cycles found over and over again first in nature and then in human behavior. Wooten reiterates the same thesis in his consideration of the act of discovery. By the time of Columbus, the European mind is nearly as set in the view that change is somewhat illusory and that there are no new things as their ancient counterparts, say in Mesopotamia, would have been, or even later in Rome. It is fixed, that European mind is, on looking to the past in a profoundly conservative worldview. With the rise of discovery, this orientation quickly and permanently switches forward. Time again is once more profoundly linear, and processes are thought to be irreversible rather than cyclical. With this comes another new idea, the inevitability of progress. In Wooten's words, quote, "If the discovery of America was a happy accident, it gave rise to an even more remarkable accident, the discovery of discovery. I say more remarkable, for it is discovery itself which has transformed our world in a way that simply locating a landmass could never do. Before discovery, history was assumed to repeat itself, and tradition to provide a reliable guide to the future. And the greatest achievement of civilization were believed not to lie in the present or the future, but in the past, in ancient Greece and classical Rome. It is easy to say that our world is made by science or by technology, but scientific and technological progress depend on a pre-existing assumption, the assumption that there are discoveries to be made." End quote. Wooten then goes on to quote a man by the name of Louis Leroy, or Regius. Leroy is a professor of Greek, and in 1575 he wrote a summation of this new attitude that stands in marked contrast to the words of John Donne that we opened this episode with. Quote, "There remain more things to be sought out than are already invented and found. And let us not be so simple as to attribute so much unto the ancients, that we believe they have known all and said all, without leaving anything to be said by those who should come after them. Let us not think nature has given them all of her good gifts, that she might be barren in time to come. How many secrets of nature have been first known and found out in this age? I say, new lands, new seas, new form of men, manners, and customs, new diseases and new remedies, new ways of heavens and of the ocean, never before found out, and new stars seen. Yea, and how many remain to be known by our posterity? That which is now hidden, with time will come to light, and our successors will wonder that we are ignorant of them." End quote. Leroy is writing 80 years after Columbus's discovery, but already so much has changed. As exploration and discovery of the New World continued, new flora and fauna were arriving back in Europe in ways that exploded the old Aristotelian systems of biological classification. As new ways of understanding what was being discovered were being created, this forced a reevaluation of old ideas and pictures that provided new insight into what had been thought for millennia. Additionally, seminal new works had appeared in astronomy, cosmography, and medicine that fundamentally recast the pictures and paradigms of previously held views. While we have discussed this in reference to Copernicus and his work on astronomy, there were similar revolutions going on in the understanding of human anatomy and in the description of the sublunary spheres, most notably in the area of geography. Within 60 years of Leroy's work, Kepler will shatter the idea of perfect heavenly spheres, and Galileo will call into question almost all of Aristotle's celestial and terrestrial physics. In the writings of both, these men show a drive to discover what is previously unknown. Nowhere in their work is there a sense that they're merely uncovering the work of some older, ancient Greek or Roman philosopher. Kepler's entire research program, in fact, rests on his seeking harmonies theretofore unknown. Galileo explicitly rejects and then continues to make a point of rejecting the ideas of the natural philosophers and the natural philosophy that had been held to date in order to discover new descriptions of nature based on careful observation and experimentation. And these are just two examples of what is taking place across the whole of natural philosophy and mathematics. From 1550 onward, there is a huge spike in book titles with the word new in the title or the front plate description. This change from titles that were commentaries on past things to expositions on new discoveries presages the shift from valuing past knowledge as the ultimate authority to that of carefully structured experience. By this time, specifically in 1554, the word discovery enters the English language, and it's not coincidental that the first patent application was filed in England by the Italian engineer Jacobus and Contius. In his patent application, he writes of discovering, quote, new kinds of wheel machines. In granting the patent, the English court will write, quote, it is right that inventors should be rewarded and protected against others making profit out of their discoveries, end quote. This idea brings us to our final subject for this episode, the rise of competition as a driving force behind science. When you look at the investigation of nature, one of the things you don't see until the 1500s is what is known as a priority dispute. We've spent a good deal of time on this podcast discussing the dispute between Tycho and Ursus over who was responsible for what is sometimes called the geo-heliocentric model of the solar system, where the Earth is at the center and not moving, and the sun goes around the Earth, and then everything else goes around the sun. As we saw, this was really an overriding concern of Tycho's, that he not only established the idea was first his, but that Ursus should be punished in a court of law for stealing that idea and then claiming it as his own. While this is not the first case of a priority dispute, that distinction seems to go to a pair of mathematicians over the development of an algebraic technique to simplify a difficult type of calculation. It illustrates something that only seems to come into play after the idea of discovery becomes entrenched. Competition to be the first to discover things begins to drive ambitious and talented individuals. While this is certainly not the only motivating factor, as can be seen in Kepler's motivation to see into the mind of the Creator, it does provide an impetus to not only seek new knowledge, but to establish that one has found it first. In 1539, Copernicus, a man who first learned of Columbus's discovery while an undergraduate, is sitting on what is his greatest intellectual accomplishment, unwilling to publish it lest he look like a fool. Yet, in that year, the much younger Rheticus, a man born and raised in a world after Columbus's discovery, and familiar with the power of the printing press, will meet the older man and almost immediately seek to get that new information out into the world. In post-Reformation Europe, split into competing political and religious entities, there's great value in learning or knowing something new. When Frederick II of Denmark establishes the new research facility on Veen, he is doing it not only because he's interested in astronomy, but because he wanted to be known as a monarch who discovered things. He also hopes that the work Tycho does on the island would give the king and the kingdom an edge in its ongoing conflict with Sweden on the one hand, and to counter the rising power of the German states to the south. This spirit of competition will push the doing of science forward in ways that are not found in places where competition is not present at the time, places such as the Ottoman Empire and China. As we conclude, I hope you'll forgive the shorter episode this week. I had originally intended to do a bit more, but this is the last full week of classes at my institution, and so all of the various things that have been put off, both academically and administratively, sort of had to end up getting done this week. As such, I found that I've had a lot more assignments to help with and meetings to attend, and thus a lot less time to read and write than I would normally like. Hopefully, though, with the approaching holiday season, I will find a little bit more time to devote to the show, and the length of the episodes and sort of the quality of everything here will improve. I also want to encourage everyone who has an interest in this subject of the scientific revelation to check out David Wooten's book, The Invention of Science. I don't know if it's available on Audible, but I found it an absolutely fascinating read. While you may or may not agree with this thesis and the conclusions he draws from it, I can guarantee you'll find his ideas interesting and worth your time to engage critically. Rarely have I found a treatment of a subject that digs into a topic in as innovative a way and thus avoids some of the same old tired arguments while still being able to consider them. For those looking for something intellectually stimulating to read during this holiday season, I recommend the book highly. And since I've mentioned it a couple of times, let me take a moment to wish everyone a joyous holiday season. Here in the United States, we'll be observing Thanksgiving with our usual bout of feasting and football, but I do want to take a moment to give thanks to and for all of you who take the time to join the Odyssey each week. It's an honor to navigate such a fine crew and vessel. Also, as we head into the time near the winter solstice, in which nearly every culture celebrates the rebirth of the sun in some way, let me wish you a season of light. We have some exciting things planned here at the Odyssey as a way of helping you through the madness of the consumer hype, but I hope in all of the hustle and busyness that seems to surround this period, you can find the time to reconnect. If you'd like, go back and listen to some of our early episodes in this series. If you live in the Northern Hemisphere, this is a time when the skies, at their coldest and darkest, are actually the most beautiful. Also, take some time to listen to the episodes on the astronomy of ancient cultures, and maybe on December 21st, find an open field and greet the rising sun. In doing so, you will take part in one of the oldest practices humanity has been engaged in, and will be celebrating one of the greater triumphs of the human intellect, our ability to predict the seasons. Next week, we'll continue our discussion of the scientific revolution by considering the roughly 1 century period between Tycho's observation of a new star and Newton's publication of the Principia. Until then, full sails on your journey.